On October the 12th, 2021, and then again on the 5th of November 2021, the acting Chief of Defense Staff, as he then was, General Eyre, issued directives requiring that all members of the Canadian Armed Forces receive COVID-19 vaccination. So today on Don't Talk TV, I want to take a bit of a look at that and discuss some ideas of how members of our armed forces might be able to approach this situation. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So as I indicated in the preamble, today I want to do something a little bit different and focus on something fairly specific, that being the directive of the Chief of Defense Staff requiring all members of the Canadian Armed Forces to receive one of the COVID-19 vaccinations. I call them vaccinations as a matter of convenience. That's what they're referred to. I know many people question whether they actually are vaccinations. There's a number of sites with medical professionals who can talk about that. I'm focusing on the law because that's my area of expertise. And although, as I always mention, I'm a criminal defense lawyer, that's been my career. And really the only experience I've had with military law is way back in 2001 when I was still an infantry officer in the reserves. And also in law school, I was made the assisting officer to one of the troops who was charged with a summary offense. I remember the adjutant telling me, like, well, you're in law school, so we're making you the assisting officer. So that's my only real experience, although I have a very special place in my heart for what's happening to members of the Canadian Armed Forces as a former and current member of the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves. Given that close place in my heart for the Canadian Armed Forces, I've been doing research and looking into this. I want to share some of the fruits of that research, although, again, given my lack of experience, you may want to take my views with a grain of salt, but since I'm not aware of anyone else who is an expert in this doing these sorts of videos, I wanted to give what information I could. So we'll take a look at the directive and a couple of things that jumped out at me from that. We'll take a look at the religious exemption possibility and what that means. And then I'll talk a little bit about some ideas of how one might use procedures that are available to members of the Canadian Armed Forces if a religious accommodation or other accommodation is rejected. So as a starting point, I'm going to look at the CDS Directive 002 on CAF COVID-19 vaccination. It's dated November 2021. It actually came out on November the 5th. So one of the things that jumps out at me, paragraph 4 here, outlines the fact that the Department of National Defense and Canadian Forces Code of Values and Ethics includes ethical principle to obey and support lawful authority. That's pretty standard for a military, but then it goes on to state that according to the CDS directive, vaccination is an expected behavior applicable to all Canadian Armed Forces members regardless of their level, position, or rank, and those who don't comply with the directive on CAF COVID-19 vaccination are in breach of the behaviors expected in the code. So it's really strange what's being done here. Section 126 of the National Defense Act does give the authority to order soldiers to take inoculations. This has happened in the past. For example, if soldiers are being deployed to sub-Saharan Africa, they have to take anti-malaria drugs or vaccines. But they're not using Section 126 of the National Defense Act here, so they're not issuing an order, yet they're saying that declining this particular medical treatment would be in violation of the ethics of obeying and supporting lawful authority. So it's really interesting how they're trying to have it both ways, and this really smacks to me of ideological purity test, not medical health and safety related. And there's a couple other things in the document that support this view of mine. And in fact, it's in the very previous paragraph where it outlines the fact that the Government of Canada policy is not applicable to the Canadian Armed Forces, but the directive has been issued to ensure the Canadian Armed Forces continues to demonstrate leadership to other Canadian government departments and to all Canadians, and to continue to protect the defense team. So again, that's really important here. We're not talking it's because people are going to be unsafe if they're not vaccinated. It's because they have to demonstrate leadership. This is the first time in my life I've ever come across the concept of receiving a particular medical treatment being an aspect of demonstrating leadership. Following on this ideological purity test concept, paragraph 11, subparagraph 8 was another one that jumped out at me. It says that commanding officers may consider reporting a change in personal circumstances when considering security clearances for Canadian Armed Forces members who are non-compliant with the Canadian Armed Forces COVID-19 vaccination policy for stated reasons which may raise doubts about the reliability or loyalty to the institution. So, declining a medical treatment may raise doubts about reliability or loyalty to the institution. So again, this to me really smacks of ideological purity test, and that may be very important if a charter challenge is launched at some point. It may also be important in the grievance process if one decides to go through that. And the Oakes test that we've discussed previously is demonstrating leadership a proportionate reason, and is demonstrating ideological purity a proportionate reason to force individuals to receive a medical treatment. It's completely unprecedented, so I really don't know how the courts would rule, but it seems to me that that's going to be a much tougher road to hoe than health and safety. Now that said, the CDS directive allows for accommodation under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the one that I want to focus on is the right to freedom of religion, and the right to have accommodation to one's religious views, because there's a number of religious views that the taking of COVID-19 vaccines conflict with. So a very important decision from the Supreme Court of Canada on this issue of what is religion, what's protected by the Charter and other laws when it comes to protecting religion, is Syndicat Northcrest and Amselem. It's a 2004 Supreme Court decision. As always, I'll have a link to this in the show description. So if we go down to paragraph 39, Justice Iacobucci, who is writing the majority decision, states that in order to define religious freedom, we must first ask ourselves what we mean by, quote, religion, unquote. So defined broadly, religion typically involves a particular and comprehensive system of faith and worship. Religion also tends to involve the belief in a divine, superhuman, or controlling power. In essence, religion is about freely and deeply held personal convictions or beliefs connected to an individual's spiritual faith and integrally linked to one's self-definition in spiritual fulfillment, the practice of which allow individuals to foster a connection with the divine or with the subject or object of that spiritual faith. So it's important to keep this definition in mind as you're trying to craft a request for religious accommodation. Do the views that I hold, or the concerns I have, do they match up with a deeply personally held belief that's connected to one's spiritual faith? Goes on at paragraph 40 to note that this court has long articulated an expansive definition of freedom of religion, which revolves around the notion of personal choice and individual autonomy and freedom. So by expansive, it's a large definition. It's not a narrow definition. Paragraph 43 is also important, where it notes that the emphasis is on personal choice of religious beliefs. So in Justice Iacobucci's opinion, and it's the majority opinion, he says these decisions and commentary should not be construed to imply that freedom of religion protects only those aspects of religious belief or conduct that are objectively recognized by religious experts as being obligatory tenets or precepts of a particular religion. So it's very important, for example, if you have a religious leader who's publicly stated that it's okay to take the COVID-19 vaccination, but you yourself still nevertheless have a strong objection. It doesn't have to be a mandatory tenet of your religion. It's your personal belief. Finally, paragraph 50 is extremely important, where the Supreme Court says, in my view, the state is in no position to be, nor should it become, the arbiter of religious dogma. Accordingly, courts should avoid judicially interpreting and thus determining, either explicitly or implicitly, the content of a subjective understanding of religious requirement, obligation, precept, commandment, custom, or ritual. Secular judicial determinations of theological or religious disputes, or of contentious matters of religious doctrine, unjustifiably entangle the court in the affairs of religion. That said, while a court is not qualified to rule on the validity or veracity of any given religious practice or belief, or to choose among various interpretations of a belief, it is qualified to inquire into the sincerity of a complainant's belief, where sincerity is in fact an issue. Short version of that is the state, and therefore the Canadian Armed Forces, is incompetent to determine what your religious beliefs are. They can only determine whether they're sincerely held. So you certainly cannot lie or pretend that you have religious beliefs that you don't really have, but if you sincerely hold religious beliefs, the Supreme Court says they can't question them. So the focus should, in my view, should be not only explaining what your religious beliefs are if you're seeking accommodation, but also demonstrating that these are sincerely held beliefs, and the longer you've held them, probably the stronger that sincerity argument is going to be. I suspect there'd be a high level of skepticism if one who's essentially lived their life as an atheist suddenly, quote, found religion, unquote, in the last month. Well, this video is taking a bit longer than I expected it to, so this will be broken down into 2 parts. Next week, I'll cover off the procedures and some interesting things in the QRNOs about the release process, since it's administrative release, that it looks like they're planning on getting rid of soldiers on who haven't taken the medical treatment that they want them to take. As usual, this video is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, you can contact another lawyer or contact myself. As I've been saying for a few weeks now, I'm not taking new clients. However, I'm going to make an exception for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. If you can't find someone else who can assist you can call me, and I'll take as many cases as I can until I get overwhelmed again, and I'll give a reduced rate given my lack of experience in this field. And if there's any topics you'd like to see me cover, please send an email to the email address listed below or leave a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.